Welcome everyone. Um, Buenos días a todos, bienvenidos. Esta es nuestra última conferencia en diálogos entre matemáticas y cultura y tenemos el honor de tener a la doctora Nina Engelhartd que nos va a hablar sobre Making New with Mathematics, Literature, Mathematics and the First World War. Eh, Ella trabaja en Alemania, se dedica a cosas de literatura y ha estado muy interesada recientemente en trabajos en el área de investigación entre literatura y matemáticas y en ciencia y literatura. Y le damos la bienvenida. Welcome, welcome, Nina.
Buenos dias. Thank you very much. I understand a bit of Spanish, but I can't speak it, so in English works better for me. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. For me, actually, it's quite unusual to be in a seminar on mathematics and culture. So usually I'm in seminars on culture and mathematics or literature and mathematics. So mathematics always comes second. And I reflected on that a little bit, and I'd like to start, but just by pointing out 3 points that might reveal that I'm indeed coming from literature to mathematics. So I'm talking about a literary text in some detail, as you will notice. I use a case study to arrive at or gesture at a more general argument, and the style of my presentation is closer to reading a paper, which is the standard in the humanities, at least in Germany and Britain, and less giving a talk, which I gather is more done in mathematics and the sciences. So now you know what to expect, and I'd like to begin with an image. You might actually have seen that. It's in the background of the poster for this talk. And this is the entirety of the image. It's a poster poem by the futurist poet Filippo Tomasetti Marinetti, and it's called Après la Marne, Joffre visita le front en auto. So after the Marne, Joffre visited the front by car. The Marne is a river in France here, and Joffre is the French general Joseph Joffre, who served as commander-in-chief of the French forces during the First World War. And in 1914, he stopped the German invasion of France in the First Battle of the Marne and thus prevented the capture of Paris. So he's known as the hero or the victor of the Marne. You can also see at the bottom of the image here an alternative title for the poster poem. It translates into mountain plus valley plus street times Joffre. So that alternative title draws attention to the mathematical symbols that we see in the poster poem itself. So you might be able to see pluses and minuses and radical signs and so on. And Marinetti aimed to what he called liberate words. That's the title at the very top, the first line, Parole in libertà, so words in freedom. And he wanted to free words from linear reading and from a strict setting on the page. So instead of standard lines on the page, here your eyes follow diagonals or curves or just a random order. And his liberation of words also employs mathematical symbols, because Marinetti called for replacing punctuation with mathematical symbols to indicate movement and action. So he announced mathematical signs will be used, plus, minus, x, and so on and so forth. And he explained, I create true theorems or lyrical equations, introducing numbers which I've intuitively chosen and placed within the very center of a word, with a certain quantity of plus, minus, x equal. I can give the thickness, the mass, the volumes of things which words otherwise have to express. The arrangement plus, minus, plus, x, for example, serves to render the changes and accelerations in speed of an automobile. So with this in mind, we can go back to the poster poem and its use of mathematical signs to illustrate General Joffre's visit of the battlefield of the Marne in September 1914. So to suggest one reading of this poster poem, you might see the S's on the left-hand side. These could also be integral signs, and they could stand for the river Marne. The M's that you see could stand for mountains. And on the left bottom part, the word guerre stands out, so French for war. And we have an indication of the sounds of machine guns, so ta 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 ta, that is printed there. We also have a list of numbers, very small, in the left upper corner. These could refer to tactical calculations of materials or soldiers' lives. And the pluses can be read either as crosses on the battlefield or as the increased velocity of General Joffre's car as he visits the Marne. These are only some interpretations here, but I want to make a more general point, namely that mathematics and mathematical symbols in this case play a role in depicting and coming to terms with the First World War in literature. In Marinetti's poem, the mathematical symbols, together with the words in freedom that are liberated from conventions of typography and sense, narrate the story of Joffre's journey in a new visual form. Such use of mathematical signs in futurist poetry disrupts traditional ways of reading and signal the need to find new ways of looking at and representing a world in war and turmoil. So Marinetti's futurist poetry presents math as differing from everyday discourse and as a means to express a world in war. So math works as a means of modern expression here. And in this sense, Marinetti follows the famous dictum of the modernist poet Ezra Pound, who said, "Make it new." And Pound also turned to mathematics to find a new means of expression that he claims counteracts the vagueness of literary language. But here, I want to look at another example of modernist use of number, namely a poem by T.S. Eliot. And this is the first half of the second stanza of his Triumphal March. Eliot said this is the most difficult poem to read aloud. I'm not attempting it, but it might be quite easy to see why it might be difficult to read it out loud. I'll just have you take a look at it here. So as you see, this first half of the second stanza is taken up by a list of weapons and military equipment, and the numbers stand out here, both when seeing the poem printed on the page and also when trying to read it out loud. That's one of the difficulties, reading out these numbers here. The numbers add to expressing the extraordinary, upsetting scale of the war. And there is a sense that traditional words and language are not adequate to represent the war and its scale and its atrocities, and that numbers offer a way to render the scale and the inhumanity of the war. So this clearly is not about individuals, but about large masses. And as we go along the list of numbers, we might expect and fear a last number, namely the number of victims of the war. Here, I'd like to point out that Eliot was not averse to mathematics, quite the contrary. He was interested more generally in how mathematical language could work as a model for innovations in literary writing. So how numbers and symbols and so on could work to provide new ways of expression. And he was particularly impressed by Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead's Principia Mathematica, a work on the foundations of mathematics. And Eliot celebrated that as making English a language in which it is possible to think clearly and exactly on any subject. The Principia Mathematica are perhaps a greater contribution to our language than they are to mathematics. I think that's debatable, but that was Eliot's view here. So Eliot praised the clarity and the exactness of mathematics that mathematics can bring to everyday language. And he proposed it as a model for a new writing style. So not unlike Marinetti, who also employs number and mathematical symbols for a new liberated language and way of writing. In both Eliot's and Marinetti's work then, math is used as a way to convey aspects of the First World War, but math is not presented as complicit with the war, but as also offering new means of expression. So more exact, more precise, but also more free, or a way of liberating writing from its conventions. So from the very short poems by Marinetti and Eliot, I'd like to move on to a longer text, the massive 2,000-page novel, The Man Without Qualities, by Austrian author Robert Musil, or more precisely the novel Fragment, because it remained unfinished. So I'm moving to the second section of the talk. Musil addresses how mathematics and literature are ways to investigate truth about the world, or understandings of the world. And Musil is particularly interested in a practical aspect, so about how mathematics and literature work as ways of approaching life as models of living. I briefly want to introduce the novel. There are 4 books in total that make up The Man Without Qualities, and the first 2, the ones I focus on, were published in the early 1930s. The novel is set in Musil's home country, Austria, and it spans the year before the outbreak of the First World War. There isn't much conventional action in the novel, but it is concerned with a feeling of crisis and fundamental change at that time. So in the early 20th century, there was a widely shared sense that society was changing. So in terms of class distinction, women's rights, religious faith is on the wane, and so on. Further examples are political, cultural, and epistemological crisis, the idea that knowledge is not absolute, but tied to a perspective, for example, or a language crisis, with the sense that words do not have an unproblematic connection to reality, and also threats of rationalization, intellectualization, and a loss of spirit or soul. That's a very general introduction to a very complicated topic at the beginning of the 20th century. And for many thinkers in the early 20th century, the First World War presented a manifestation and condensation of all of these crises of the time. Musil's The Man Without Quality presents this sense of an all-encompassing crisis in the year before the outbreak of the First World War. So the setting is Austria in 1913, or rather the novel is set in Carcania, which is a nickname for the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary. And crucially, as the main protagonist Ulrich points out, there no longer are certain grounds on which to determine the right way to live. So life is in crisis, Carcania is in crisis, and the pre-war period is characterized by disintegration and conflicting views. So Ulrich points out, our times rejoice in a number of great ideas, and by a special kindness of fate, each idea is paired with its opposite. In the novel, Carcania then sets up a campaign with the aim of determining the essential being of Carcanian culture, and thus combat the forces of disintegration and conflict. Ulrich is part of this campaign and its plans to exhibit Carcania's unified nature in a celebration to make 1918 a jubilee year for our Emperor of Peace. And this jubilee year is then expected to free a unifying force and enable the modern world to find its true being. However, the futility of this campaign is immediately obvious to readers, because the year 1918 was hardly one of celebrating any emperor of peace, but it was a year of war, of the First World War. And so The Man Without Qualities proposes that Carcania and the world more broadly has changed dramatically, and that it is in need for redefinition. And the novel also proposes that this fundamental change in worldviews is most visible in mathematics, and that math also holds the potential clue for a necessary redefinition. So math is described as the new method of thought itself, the mind itself, the very wellspring of the times, and the primal source of an incredible transformation. So mathematics is introduced as central to the year before the outbreak of the First World War, and for any transformation out of this crisis. The main protagonist, Ulrich, himself is a mathematician in the novel, and he is working out a new foundational theory in mathematics. And this work for him is connected to the question of the foundations of life. That's the second quotation here. If someone had asked him at any point while he was writing treatises on mathematical problems or mathematical logic, what it was he hoped to achieve, he would have answered that there was only one question worth thinking about, the question of the right way to live. So we see here that mathematics and the sense of crisis in Carcania are intertwined for Ulrich. He believes that math might offer a way out of the crisis, that is, offer a solution to the problem of the right way to live. And he hopes to employ the new method of thought that mathematics provides to help Carcania out of its impasse and the crisis that, as we know, will end in the First World War. Let's move to the next point. So, as I showed in an earlier quotation, a symptom of the crisis in Carcania is a disintegration of things into everything and its opposite. And Ulrich identifies mathematics as one of the poles into which ideas split. And remember that this core question is the right way to live. So importantly for him, ideas about morality split into two poles. So he said, maybe our morality is already splitting into two components. I might also say into mathematics and mysticism. So morality, supposed to determine the right way to live, has split into mathematics and mysticism. So there's a pole associated with rationality, precision, clarity, and a pole tied to the non-rational transcendence of the ordinary and intuition. And Ulrich holds that neither pole alone can give an appropriate answer to the question of the right way to live. So he says that rational mathematics is satisfied to be precise and disregards value, while mysticism is said to derive its insight from the so-called great and eternal truth and is based on a feeling of wholeness that has no basis in reality. So, he concludes, a pessimist could say that the results of the first case of mathematics are worth nothing, and in the second case, mysticism, are not true. Then, since neither mathematics nor mysticism alone can act as an orientation in life, Ulrich believes that a synthesis of the two poles has to be achieved in order to counter the disintegration of morality. These attempts by Ulrich at a synthesis of mathematics and mysticism are in the center of the novel. However, he finds that counteracting the disintegration of morality is further complicated by the fact that mathematics itself splits into competing factions in the early 20th century. So he comes to question that mathematics is solely the opposite of mysticism, but sees math itself as combining rational elements and mystical elements. So traditional math might have been associated with rationality and the opposite of mysticism, but modern mathematics is no longer one of the poles, an extreme of rationality, but it is itself split into traditional rationality and its opposite. And Ulrich is such a modern mathematician. He is up to date with current developments. So the novel explains he was one of those mathematicians called logicians for whom nothing was ever correct and who were working out a new foundational theory. So I want to draw attention to two aspects here. Firstly, Ulrich is interested in a new foundational theory of mathematics. So new foundations, not unlike the search for a new foundation of Carcania and the right way to live. And he is identified not simply as a mathematician, but as a logician, so an adherent to a particularly movement or school. I'm coming to an area, a section of my paper where I'm sure you have much more information than I do, but I'll just give it a go anyway. And if there are comments to be made or corrections to be suggested, then I'm happy to hear that in the discussion. So, in my understanding, logicism is one of three schools that propose foundational approaches to mathematics in the early 20th century. In what has been called the foundational crisis of mathematics, and we've just had, before the talk started, we had a little chat about possible critiques or embracing this idea of a foundation of mathematics. I know that some mathematicians are quite reluctant to do that. So in what has been called a foundational crisis in mathematics in the early 20th century, we see a conflict between the schools of formalism and logicism on one side and intuitionism on the other side. And in that sense, mathematics could be seen as in a situation of disorientation and opposed views. So not all mathematicians shared that sense of crisis, and many continued their work undisturbed. But in talks of several prominent mathematicians about mathematics, they described us as lacking fundamental certitudes. So a lack of certitude, not like other areas experiencing a sense of crisis at the time. Logicism, so the school Ulrich identifies with, is one approach to establishing the foundations of math, but other schools propose other foundational approaches. And in a way, they constitute an opposite to the idea of logicism. Deciding either for logicism or its opposite of intuitionism has far-reaching implications, not only for math itself, but for notions of reason, of value, and of the possibility of knowledge in general. As David Hilbert, a leading mathematician at the time, is said to suggest, if mathematical thinking is defective, where are we to find truth and certitude? So to appreciate the division regarding the foundations of mathematics, I'd like to briefly introduce these respective schools. Logicism, the school Ulrich identifies with, was founded by Gottlob Frege in 1884, and it views math as part of logic. So it holds that the foundations of math can be achieved by logical elements, such as formation rules that work like grammatical rules. And in this respect, logicism shares some affinities with formalism, which bases mathematical foundations on formal but not necessarily logical elements. And both schools emphasize the inherent logic and the systematic nature of mathematics. So formalism regards mathematics as a system of signs that can freely be manipulated as long as there are no internal contradictions. And David Hilbert, the founding father of formalism, I described math as a game played according to certain rules with meaningless marks on paper. So since formalist mathematics does not refer to anything outside itself, it has no extra mathematical meaning or value. The opposed view is intuitionism. Intuitionism asks precisely about the truth and value of meaning of mathematics in the world. And it answers these questions by positing intuition as the origin of math. The human mind is the seat of intuition. So ultimately, the human being is the origin of math, relates mathematics to reality, and guarantees its meaning and value in the world. And the founder of intuitionism, L.E.J. Brouwer, even argued that mathematics needs no deeper grounds than moral mysticism, and he advocated for keeping non-mathematical aims in view. Let the motivation behind mathematics be the craving for the good. Just to summarize that, math splits into these two opposed views in the foundational crisis. The logicist formalist view, that's rational and focused on inner mathematical coherence, and by contrast, intuitionism assumes a non-rational origin of math in human intuition and evaluates mathematics in view of its meaning and value in the world. In The Man Without Qualities, Ulrich's logicism is presented as contributing to a loss of essence and sense of crisis. So the novel presents logicist math as not allowing to better grasp the inner qualities of reality, but as referring only to mathematics itself. So mathematicians work in a self-contained field and resemble in the novel racing cyclists pedaling away for dear life, blind to everything in the world except the back wheel of the rider ahead of them. So mathematicians are disconnected from reality and only focused on other mathematicians. And the fact that Ulrich retires from the outside world to do his mathematical work further emphasizes this disconnection. So he had drawn the curtains and was working in the subdued light like an acrobat in a dimly lit circus arena, rehearsing dangerous new somersaults for a panel of experts before the public has been let in. So removed from nature into an artistic sphere, Ulrich devises new moves that have to be approved by the mathematical community before being released for application to the world. And Ulrich reflects the self-referential turn of mathematics in his own life. He also, outside mathematics, he realizes that his connections to the world had become pale, shadowy, and negative, and that he has lost the capacity to apply his abilities. So he's a man without qualities, somebody who can't decide what to be. So he reverts to his realm of his own thoughts and decides to take a year-long holiday from life. So he retreats from life to work out the foundations of how to live. However, Ulrich is not prepared to completely embrace logicist self-referentiality and to relinquish the possibility of having an impact on the world. His will to act on reality shows in an encounter with fellow mathematician Dr. Strasstil in the novel. So Dr. Strasstil is on her way to a holiday in the mountains, so not a holiday from life, but just a normal holiday. And her situation implies that she has no more direct relation to physical reality than logicist mathematics. She asks indignantly what she needed nature for. She could lie on the mountain meadow for 3 whole days without stirring. So Strasstil feels no inclination to interact with or to act upon nature. She lives in the self-containment of the logician. And in contrast, Ulrich replies that a farmer would be bored when lying on the grounds he usually plows. And this illustrates his belief that nature has to be worked on in order to bear fruit, and that math should help achieve these results. So there is a sense that Ulrich works on the foundations of mathematics not for its own sake, but in order to allow for later application to reality, to the question of how to live. The connection between mathematics and life and its moral questions is also illustrated in the case of Moosbrugger, another character in the novel. In the novel, Moosbrugger is in jail. He has murdered several women, and he waits for the authorities to agree whether to sentence him to death or to declare him insane. His diminished intelligence and possibly diminished responsibility constitutes a problem for legal categories, because law recognizes, at least in the novel, not necessarily in our reality at the moment, but law in the novel only recognizes an either or. So either he is sane and declared guilty, or he is declared mentally incapacitated and therefore not guilty. Yet in life, the categories are not always clear-cut, and Moosbrugger's case is ambiguous. And it induces a re-examination of the interrelated notions of reason and responsibility. So the legal term accountability, for example, for a crime, shares an etymological root with to count. And the novel exploits this suggestive connection between rationality, accountability, and mathematics. It strengthens the shared relation of law and math to reason when the court uses a calculation exercise to evaluate Moosbrugger's accountability. So persons clearly irresponsible of their actions are thought to have no grasps of mathematics, and when asked to multiply 7 times 7, stick out their tongue. But Moosbrugger's is, as I said, not as clear-cut as a case. he is asked to add 14 to 14, and he replies, oh, about 28 to 40. This about gave them trouble, which made Moosbrugger grin. It was really simple. He knew perfectly well that you get 28 when you go from 14 to another 14. But who says you have to stop there? So Moosbrugger's somewhat idiosyncratic calculation clearly deviates from traditional rules, but it is not entirely wrong. And since the foundations of mathematics are in question at the time, it also poses a problem. So if the grounds of math are themselves unclear, then it is no longer an entirely reliable means to determine reason and responsibility. So in other words, if the foundations of math are in question, then a mathematical exercise is perhaps no reliable grounds to judge Moosbrugger's sanity and guilt. And indeed, the foundational crisis of math and the opposition between formalist logicists and intuitionist schools has a connection with the legal questions of Moosbrugger's guilt. So in law, there is a belief that between two contraries, there is no third or middle state. So it's guilty, not guilty, at least in the presentation of law in The Man Without Qualities. And this assumption is no longer a given in modern mathematics. Logicists and formalists do work from the premise that either a proposition is true or its negation is true, but the school of intuitionism does not accept the so-called law of excluded middle as an axiom. So Moosbrugger's case thus relates mathematics, accountability, and reason on several levels. Basic arithmetic is expected to determine the offender's accountability, but reveals a more complex situation than expected. And secondly, the controversy on possible states in between a binary opposition of guilty, not guilty, compares to the foundational debate between different mathematical schools. Since Moosbrugger's case can be judged only once the grounds on which to determine reason are agreed upon, his case is, in a sense, depends on foundational research in math, which thus, in a sense, becomes a question of Moosbrugger's life and death. I'd like to go back now to the connection between mathematics and reason for a moment, to show that the novel itself is organized around a juxtaposition between precise, rational, and more intuitive approaches. And these are the famous first sentences of the novel. So as you open the book, the first sentence you read is, "A barometric low hung over the Atlantic. It moved eastward toward a high-pressure area over Russia without as yet showing any inclination to bypass this high in a northerly direction. The isotherms and isotheres were functioning as they should. The air temperature was appropriate relative to the annual mean temperature." And it goes on in this vein for a couple more sentences. So this is a precise scientific account, and this is then rephrased in everyday language. In a word that characterizes the facts fairly accurately, even if it is a bit old-fashioned, it was a fine day in August 1913. So the contrasted styles of describing the same phenomenon introduce a competition between the exact rational and the vaguer, more intuitive sphere. But the two domains are, of course, united in the literary text itself. As we see in these two examples, literary language can encompass both the exact rational and the more vague and intuitive language. So at the very beginning of the novel, readers are alerted to the fact that things are not always one thing only, but that something and its opposite can coexist. And as we see in the opening, there are creative possibilities and to being able to play with something and its opposite, with rational scientific and vague intuitive language, for example. And the same holds true for mathematics, as we learn in the course of the novel. That is, The Man Without Qualities depicts mathematics as not only concerned with reason, precision, and so on, but math is also introduced in its non-rational, intuitive orientation. For example, when Ulrich solves a mathematical problem and is helped by what is described as the disconcerted feeling, which is nowadays called intuition. The flash of intuition is, so Ulrich understands, prompted by some stimulus outside the scope of everyday scientific activity and is never purely intellectual. Nevertheless, the conclusions intuition arrives at are no less true than rational deductions, and intuition can indeed even be more accurate than narrator suggests. So another character gives the example of playing billiards, and that illustrates that intuition can answer a problem that is irresolvable by precise means. So taking account of all the forces that are involved in a billiard shot results in incalculable complexity. So we are abandoned by reason, the character exclaims. And in contrast, dismissing reason from the outset and hardly thinking about playing the ball, but just doing it, that means that the task almost solves itself. Similarly, Ulrich experiences that intuition may take precedence over reason even in math, in his flash of intuition when solving the mathematical problem. And the implications of relating mathematics to intuition on a basic level are profound, as the history of intuitionism and its role in the foundational debate reveal. So tracing math back to intuition, as intuitionism does, has implications for notions of mathematical truth, meaning, and value. What I think is interesting in Musil's novel is that mathematics is depicted not simply as one of the poles of the time, so not only as the pole of the rational. It is initially introduced as that in Ulrich's juxtaposition of mathematics and mysticism, but in the course of the novel, mathematics itself is revealed to include elements of mysticism, of the non-rational, of the intuitive. So if we go back to Ulrich's motivation for doing mathematics here. So as readers, we know how important that question of the right way to live is in Austria 1913. Will mathematics help Ulrich answer the question of the right way to live in Campania and thus maybe prevent the outbreak of the First World War and lead to the celebration of the Emperor of Peace after all? As I mentioned, The Man Without Qualities is a novel fragment, so it never arrives at an answer, never arrives at the outbreak of the war. And this is not due, I suggest, to having remained a fragment, because you have to ask whether after 2,000 pages, a couple more years, a couple more pages would have resulted in a neat ending. Many scholars, and I agree, are of the opinion that the novel is unfinishable, that Musil never intended a solution and ending that he somehow missed to construe during his lifetime. In that interpretation, The Man Without Qualities is not really about finding a concrete answer, but about exploring aspects of that answer. Aspects of mathematics and mysticism, of logicism, formalism, and intuitionism, and so on, that provide possible approaches and perspectives on the problem of how to live when the foundations of life are in crisis. Not least, the novel suggests that mathematics can work as a model for a world in crisis, as a field that experiences a foundational crisis itself. Looking at math might give clues as how to address the larger crisis at hand. And Musil directly addresses the question of mathematics as a model for life in his essay, The Mathematical Man. He wrote that essay in 1913, so well before his novel, The Man Without Qualities, which was published in the 1930s, and precisely in the year in which the novel is set. Let me take a sip of drink. So the essay, The Mathematical Man, is written in a humorous and exaggerated tone. So it's not to be taken at face value. And it paints a very clear picture of the impact of mathematics on life. So in that essay, it states, we may say that we live almost entirely from the results of mathematics. With the exception of a few handmade pieces of furniture, of clothing, shoes, children, everything comes to us through the intervention of mathematical calculations. Life is not only dependent on mathematics for its comprehensibility, but has effectively come into being through it and depends on it for its existence. So the claim is clear. Life depends on mathematics for its existence. And math is established as the very basis of life, since mathematical principles are applied by physicists and then taken up by technicians to construe machines which produce the goods we use. So in this way, as the quote suggests, we may say that we live almost entirely from the results of mathematics. But the essay continues, the mathematical base of life becomes contested when the foundational principles of mathematics are put into question. So the essay goes on. Suddenly, after everything has been brought into the most beautiful kind of existence, the mathematicians came upon something wrong in the fundamentals of the whole thing that absolutely could not be put right. They actually looked all the way to the bottom and found that the whole building was standing in mid-air. So the essay here describes the situation of mathematics in its foundational crisis. The beginnings of the crisis go back further into the 19th century, when mathematicians discovered that some commonly made assumptions were incorrect, and that therefore the entire foundations of mathematics had to be re-examined. Set theory was hoped to be a foundational theory which would establish certain grounds for math, but shortly after the turn of the century, Bertrand Russell, a prominent proponent of the school of logicism, discovered a paradox in set theory, and he was worried by the implications. So a theory compromised by paradoxes cannot provide a secure basis for math. So I'm sure some of you might know the graphic novel Logicomics, which illustrates the foundational crisis, and I've taken an example of one of the pictures there. We have Russell, the main protagonist of this graphic novel. And he here explains that certainty in mathematics is vital for the possibility of certain knowledge in general. So he shows that mathematicians discovered that their world rested on shaky foundations. That's the last image there. And Russell really used the example of a world being supported by a turtle in his book Portraits from Memory, by the way. So set theory is designed to create solid foundations for math, but as Russell discovered himself, it was beset by paradoxes and in turn in need of a more fundamental theory to resolve the paradoxes. So to stay with Russell's example, another turtle has to be constructed to support the foundational theory. But this theory is riddled by paradoxes in turn, so that another turtle is needed to support it, which has its own paradoxes, and so on and so on. So it's turtles all the way down, as Russell says here. In other words, there are no certain foundations of mathematics in Russell's view. And to quote David Hilbert again, this creates a situation that is intolerable. He said, just think the definitions and deductive methods which everyone learns, teaches, and uses in mathematics, the paragon of truth and certitude, lead to absurdities or to paradoxes. If mathematical thinking is defective, where are we to find truth and certitude? So as Russell and Hilbert feared, when the foundations of mathematics are in question, the possibility of certain knowledge itself is in jeopardy. To come back to Musil's essay, The Mathematical Man. So math in that essay is described as standing in mid-air, so on turtles without solid ground. And since life is built on the results of mathematics, the whole of existence lacks a stable base. The essay then does what Ulrich suggests to do in The Man Without Qualities. It looks at mathematics to see how to deal with that crisis. And the speaker of the essay notes that despite the lack of foundations in math, things continue to work fairly well. It says the mathematicians actually looked all the way to the bottom and found that the whole building was standing in midair. But the machines worked. We must assume from this that our existence is a pale ghost. We live it, but actually only on the basis of an error without which it would not have arisen. So mathematics might not have stable foundations, but it still makes possible our existence. So although in crisis, math continues to be useful, indeed necessary for life at large. The essay then compares the foundational crisis in mathematics with our age's lack of culture. So the period of 1913 is suggested to be in a foundational crisis of culture, as culture no longer provides certain grounds. The way mathematicians deal with this crisis in their field is then proposed as a model of how to react to the lacking foundations of the period in general. So literary writers in particular are encouraged to turn to mathematics. As the narrator of that essay says, in their field, mathematicians do what we, the writers, ought to be doing in ours. Therein lies the significant lesson and model of their existence. They are an analogy for the intellectual of the future. So what is commendable in the mathematicians' response to the foundational crisis? Well, they hold on to mathematics, even though it is discovered to stand in mid-air and to be riddled by paradoxes. And in contrast, writers react to the discovered groundlessness of existence by abandoning reason. After the Enlightenment, the rest of us lost our courage. A minor failure was enough to turn us away from reason. We bet the drums against intellect and forget that without intellect, feeling is as dense as a blockhead. In this way, we have ruined our imaginative literature to such an extent that whenever one reads 2 German novels in a row, one must solve an integral equation to grow lean again. So the essay argues that instead of turning away from reason, writers should imitate the mathematicians who continues to use math even though it is in crisis, and who endures this intellectual scandal in exemplary fashion that is with confidence and pride in the devilish riskiness of his intellect. Math might be based on a tower of turtles, but the machines still work and life still exists, and literature cannot disregard the continued importance of mathematics and reason. And in some ways, Musil's novel, The Man Without Qualities, does what the essay demands writers to do. It explores possibilities of dealing with the crisis in the pre-war period without abandoning reason and without abandoning hope, and to continue working instead of throwing up one's hands in despair and doing nothing. And this involves looking at mathematics critically, questioning its foundations, including allowing Ulrich's logicist approach as well as the role of intuition. Yet seeing that even math splits into opposed approaches does not mean abandoning it as a broken tool, but continuing trust in its real effects. So I'm moving to my conclusion and the last point here. I hope it has become clear that I do not, or not only, or even primarily claim that mathematical symbols or numbers are used to represent the First World War. This can be the case, as we saw in the poems by Marinetti and Eliot, for example, but mathematics also plays a part in literary writers' engagements with the conditions that led to war, with that sense of crisis. Musil, in The Man Without Qualities and in The Mathematical Man, presents math as in crisis and as part of a larger sense of crisis that in the novel ultimately results in the war. But mathematics also encompasses hope in both texts when it continues to work despite questionable or absent foundations, and when opposed foundational schools offer different various approaches. Like the text of Musil's novel that can encompass rational, precise, and vague intuitive language that I showed in the beginning with the first sentences of the novel, math can thrive on rational, self-referential work, but also on intuition and unclear foundations. So here too, it is less about finding the correct approach, but to experiment with possibilities to keep it working, to keep mathematics and the world going despite standing in midair without foundations. As a last point, I'd like to address the idea that we can speak of a mathematical modernism that is of a cultural embeddedness of mathematics that warrants viewing it as part of a cultural movement of modernism. So the historian of mathematics Herbert Mertens has suggested that the foundational conflict in mathematics should be seen in the context of wider cultural and social questions at the time. He, in the 1990s, examined, Herbert Mertens in the 1990s examined speeches and prose writings by Hilbert and Brouwer, so the heads of the formalist and intuitionist schools, and argued that their respective positions are not purely mathematical, but also prominently address philosophical questions and moral arguments. And in this way, the foundational crisis of mathematics is connected with broader non-mathematical concerns. The historian of math, Jeremy Gray, has extended that argument and holds that modern mathematics relates to the rise of modernism in cultural spheres such as painting, music, and literature, and should be viewed as a cultural phenomenon. And then Moritz Eppler, also a historian of mathematics, has done work in identifying modernist characteristics in mathematics itself. This is the area I can least appreciate because it really involves looking at what kind of mathematics, what writing of mathematics is done. As a literary scholar, I want to suggest that literary texts such as Musil's also support the cultural embeddedness of math and the notion of a modernist mathematics. The Man Without Qualities and the essay The Mathematical Man engage with a specifically modernist math that exhibits characteristics such as self-referentiality and a sense of crisis, and including opposed tendencies of rationality and mystic intuition. And moreover, the texts by Musil propose interrelations and parallels of math with other fields, not least with literary writing. Math is even considered to be a model for literary writing. So Musil's novel and essay accord math and its modernist development a central place in its vision and employ it as interrelated with and exemplary of a sense of crisis and possible transformations in the modern West. Regarding possibilities of change, the texts explore the freedoms and pragmatic opportunities that the mathematical crisis implies and relate these to the possibilities of literature. So in other words, by considering math in view of wider questions associated with the First World War and in terms of crisis and hope, Musil texts reflects challenges to traditional perceptions of math as a domain of certainty. It negotiates the place of math in culture and explores the fruitfulness of exploring mathematics as a model for literature and ultimately for the right way to live. Thank you for your attention there. That's the end of my talk.
Thank you very much, Nina. It was really nice hearing you and figuring out these things we've been trying to figure out while reading the paragraph. I don't think we have questions from the audience, but I wanted to ask, I kept on wondering, I think it was a quote when you mentioned that Principia Mathematica had more value to literature than to mathematics. Was it a quote?
Yes, yeah, it was Eliot, T.S. Eliot, yeah, the poet.
I kept on wondering what does he mean? Maybe could you tell something about that?
Mm-hmm. So what he really means is that the attempt to make clear definitions of certain terms and use a mathematical clarity is a model for language in general. So Eliot deplored the vagueness of our everyday language. It's something that Brouwer, the mathematician, also did. And Brouwer even claimed that the vagueness of everyday language is ultimately responsible for the First World War because misunderstandings appear. Eliot didn't go quite as far, but he also felt that precision in terms, precisions in definitions and in words is useful to understand each other, to understand the world, and that the Principia Mathematica in giving precise definitions of terms is a model for that. And that by giving that model, we could also reorganize our everyday language and thereby improve it, making it more precise, more clear. I don't think it was taken up to a great extent. That's why I said, well, I'm not sure his evaluation, so Eliot's evaluation of the Principia Mathematica as being of more value for literary studies than for mathematics is necessarily correct. But I think it speaks to a larger sense in literary studies at the beginning of the 20th century, a real unease about language. I only briefly alluded to that, but basically there was a sense that no longer can we think of language as securely tied to nature. So if we say book, there is nothing that ties it to the actual object, but it's an artificial sort of random word there. And by paying attention to that, a lot of literary writers at that point said language is disintegrating. There's no trust in language anymore. So a language crisis, it's a term that's being used there as well. And I think one of the attempts to fix the language crisis is to look for mathematics as a rational and precise model along the lines of which literary language, everyday language could follow as well.
Okay. That takes me to a second question that I was wondering during your talk, which is how, as far as I can tell, like your background is pretty much in literature, but where does your interest in mathematics come from? Is it something related to what you just said?
Yeah, I guess. Well, I always liked math in school. I liked the calculation and so on. And I'm very lucky in that my father, he's a biologist, but a biologist with a strong mathematical background and interest. And then I think it was just a very naive understanding of mathematics and literature, where I thought they are so different. And then I thought literature would define it, it would talk about mathematics to define itself against it. And that was just my first entry into the field, was just thinking, I'm looking for literary texts that speak about mathematics. And I was expecting to find representations of math as maybe boring, as rational, as precise, and so on. And I slowly discovered that the history of mathematics, the philosophy of mathematics, is much more complicated, much more multifaceted. And then I became really interested in that beginning of the 20th century, where I thought questioning the foundations of mathematics, asking or working towards these sounded fascinating. And then seeing that literary authors take up that moment in mathematics as well, presented in a certain way, certainly not always correctly, but they use it to explore other questions, other senses of crisis. And I was really interested in that kind of connection. So I don't have a professional background in mathematics. I didn't study it at university, but I'm not calculating or proving anything either. It's more the history and philosophy that draws me in. And then for questions, I usually go to my dad. My sister actually is a mathematician, but she has very little interest in math, in literature. So whenever I go and try to have her explain something to me, she's sometimes a little too literal and says, no, it's r plus 0. I said, yes, but metaphorically, can you? No, it's r plus 0. So we have a certain difference in our approaches to the texts, but my father, as a biologist, is maybe the mediating person there. Yeah.
Okay, it's actually nice to hear like some kind of compliments to mathematics from a non-mathematician. Bueno, pues muchas gracias a todas las personas que nos acompañaron. Este fue el último seminario del semestre, entonces nos vemos el próximo semestre a partir de febrero, finales de febrero, quizás marzo. Estén atentos a nuestras redes sociales. Entonces, pues feliz año nuevo y nos vemos el año que entra.
Was a pleasure.
Muchas gracias.